The mess this country is in, it is not all because of Labour. Of course, they must take some of the blame. All right, actually, they should take really quite a lot of the blame. In fact, let me just get this off my chest. They left us with massive debts, the highest deficit, the country's debt crisis created by Labour. Borrow more money. Borrow, borrow, borrow. This wasn't a normal recession. It was a debt crisis. The deficit left to us by Labour was one of the highest in the world. We're here because we spent too much and borrowed too much. The only way out of a debt crisis is to deal with your debts. And you know what? They say that madness is doing the same thing over and over again, but we still haven't finished paying for Labour's debt crisis. Paid off all of Labour's deficit, not just some of it. How did they get us into this mess? Too much spending, too much borrowing, too much debt. The crisis they created, clearing up the mess we were left. You are the people who left Britain with the biggest peacetime deficit in history. It is the same old Labour. And Labour, we will never let you forget it.
Six years after the financial crisis hit the world economy, tighter rules are being proposed to prevent the big banks from ever being bailed out by the taxpayers again. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, told a meeting of regulators in Switzerland today that the plans are a watershed moment and will force banks to hold substantially more capital. He's been speaking exclusively to our business editor, Kamal Ahmed.
2008. The year when the global economy teetered on the brink of collapse. Markets were in turmoil, banks like Lehman's and the Royal Bank of Scotland were going bust, and it was left to the taxpayer to pay out billions of pounds in subsidies to banks that were just too big to fail. Today, the Governor of the Bank of England announced new global rules to make banks safer. He told me taxpayer bailouts would become a thing of the past.
Let's face it, the system we've had up until now has been totally unfair. The banks and their shareholders and their creditors, those big institutions that hold their debt, got the benefit when things went well, but when things went wrong, the British public, you and I, and subsequent generations have picked up the bill.
Events today at this drab and admittedly rather wet building in Basel, Switzerland might seem an awful long way from the real needs of the UK economy. But of course, it was only because the taxpayer was forced to spend billions of pounds bailing out the banks in 2008 that the government is today carrying huge levels of public debt. It was only because the taxpayer was forced to spend billions of pounds bailing out the banks in 2008 that the government is today carrying huge levels of public debt. Of course, what's followed are spending cuts which have affected everybody. So what was the cost of the bailout? The government spent over £100 billion rescuing RBS, Lloyds, Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley. So far, the taxpayer has been paid back £7.4 billion from Lloyds. Over £12 billion has been paid back for Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley. Plans to sell the government's stake in RBS are on hold. Under the new rules, banks will have to raise billions of pounds of new money to ensure they can weather any new economic downturn.
These are very turbulent times in financial markets.
Alistair Darling was the Chancellor who authorised the bailouts. What does he make of today's plans?
The thing that shocked many people, me included 6 years ago, is a lot of these banks had absolutely no idea just how deep in trouble they were. They just didn't understand the risks they'd taken on. Now, that has changed, but you've always got to be vigilant because, you know, people can sometimes have short memories.
Short memories and bad habits. Can the new regulations really insulate the taxpayer?
Does this protect us from every possible eventuality, including those we can't imagine? No, it doesn't. But does it mean that if an individual major bank makes mistakes, and it should fail, it will? And it can do so without recourse to the public purse?
2008 might now seem a long time ago, But these rules, if agreed, won't be enforced until 2019, more than 11 years after the financial crisis saddled governments and taxpayers with enormous debts. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News, Basel.
What was the fundamental thing that went wrong? And have you changed your mind about what it was in the last 3 or 4 years?
I think my view on it has evolved. I think this was the interaction between serious macroeconomic problems around the world.
And lack of coordination.
And lack of coordination. I think one of the very interesting aspects of this is that I don't think it's easy to go back and say, could any one country on its own have found a way through it? But we, as one country, could not have stopped the financial crisis from occurring.
You say that this country could have done things differently, of course. What about the whole argument that there was light touch regulation, which in retrospect turned out to have been a terrible mistake?
I don't think it was the regulation as such. If we asked the question, how much capital do banks need to have to persuade people in markets to lend them money at very low interest rates? Well, we know the answer to that was very little, because they had very little. After the crisis, if you ask the same question, the answer is an enormous amount. I don't think the difference between those two is down to regulation. I think it's down to a complete change in the psychology and fear in financial markets about the creditworthiness of the banks to which they had previously lent. And that's not something that it's easy to change. So I'm sure that it was possible to improve the regulatory framework, and looking back, the leverage of banks was absurdly high. It should have been much, much lower. And it's very important that we learn the lesson from that in the future.
And was that the fault of the central bank?
The central bank didn't have responsibility for those regulations, but I don't think it's a question of, there's any point blaming anyone for it. Financial markets themselves did not think that banks were really at risk. And it came as an enormous surprise to everyone when people found that markets no longer trusted banks. How can we make the world better for the future? And I think there are some big lessons there, but they're not easy ones to implement, which is why I don't think we've really yet got to the heart of what went wrong. We've made the banking system safer, that is true, but is it really safe enough? Will it be, would we survive another big financial crisis that could yet come?
And you don't think the answer is we certainly would?
I don't think we're yet at the point where we can be confident the banking system will be entirely safe. And I don't think any one country can handle this problem on its own. So that's still a big issue.
Can I just chip in on the politics of this? Because you say there's no point in blaming. It's over now. And in economic terms, one can see you want to move on, you want to address yourself in the next problem. But it's the context, isn't it, of the next election, actually. One of the important parts of the context is going to be, can you legitimately say Labour were to an extent responsible for what happened, or is that an illegitimate thing to say? So on a sort of percentage from 0 to 100%, where would you place Labour's culpability?
I'm not going to talk about individual parties' culpability, because I think the real problem was that a shared intellectual view right across the entire political spectrum and shared throughout financial markets that things were going pretty well. Now, there were obvious imbalances. We knew the position was unsustainable, but it wasn't entirely obvious where it would come unstuck. And I think that's something that everyone shared, and I think the right thing to do now is to say, well, how can we make it better for the future?
George Osborne's I Was Right World Tour reached Brazil this week. George Osborne perilously close to telling the world, I told you so, on the deficit, on austerity and the economy. But the economy naturally moves in upturns and downturns, in very slow-moving cycles. And the problem for Mr. Osborne is that he wanted to take none of the blame when there was the downturn. Now we have the upturn. He's greedy for all the credit.
We're really on plan B or C now rather than plan A. And also, of course, we've got a long way yet to go before this fiscal consolidation is over, so it's a bit too early to conclude that the economy has really escaped unscathed.
We cannot go on with the rigid, outdated employment legislation of the past. I know the critics will say, What about workers' rights? Our plan is right. Our plan will work. I know that you can't see it or feel it right now. The most important part is the part you can't see. And the vital point is this: if you don't stick with it, it won't work.